London, September 1988. Michael Caine was walking through Russell Square on his way to a lunch meeting with his agent, enjoying one of those rare crisp autumn mornings when London seemed to shake off its usual gray melancholy and display the kind of golden beauty that reminded residents why they loved this ancient city despite its many flaws. At 55, Michael had developed the habit of taking these solitary walks through London's parks and squares, finding in them a connection to his roots and a respite from the demands of an international acting career that kept him traveling constantly between film sets, studios, and publicity events. But on this particular September morning, as he passed the fountain at the center of Russell Square, he noticed something that would stop him in his tracks and ultimately reveal a secret about his family's past that would transform his understanding of how interconnected human lives really are, and how acts of courage and kindness can echo across decades in ways that the people who perform them never imagine or expect. Sitting on a weathered wooden bench near the fountain was an elderly man, probably in his late 70s, wearing a faded brown overcoat that had clearly seen many seasons, and a cap pulled down over thinning gray hair. The man was systematically breaking pieces of bread into small fragments and scattering them on the ground around his feet, where a growing congregation of pigeons pecked and cooed with obvious familiarity and trust. What caught Michael's attention wasn't the scene itself. Feeding pigeons was a common enough sight in London's parks, but the methodical, almost ritualistic way the old man performed this daily task. There was something ceremonial about his actions, as if feeding these birds was not just a casual act of kindness, but a form of meditation, remembrance, or perhaps penance. The man seemed completely absorbed in his task, paying careful attention to each bird, making sure that even the smaller, more timid pigeons received their share of the bread. He spoke to them quietly, his voice too soft for Michael to make out the words, but his tone was gentle and affectionate, like someone talking to old friends who had shared many conversations over the years. Michael found himself slowing his pace, then stopping entirely, drawn by something indefinable about the scene. Perhaps it was the man's obvious solitude or the careful dignity with which he performed this simple act, or simply the peaceful quality of the moment in the midst of London's constant urban energy. As Michael watched, the old man looked up from his birds and their eyes met across the square. The man's face registered first surprise, then something like recognition, followed by what appeared to be a moment of internal debate about whether to acknowledge Michael's presence. Finally, the man raised his hand in a tentative greeting, and Michael found himself walking toward the bench without really deciding to do so. "Excuse me," the old man said as Michael approached, his voice carrying the working-class London accent that Michael recognized from his own childhood in the East End. "You're Michael Caine, aren't you?" "I am," Michael replied, stopping a respectful distance from the bench. "And you are?" "Albert Whitman," the man said, half rising from the bench in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "Please, sit down if you've got a moment. I've been hoping for years that I might run into you somewhere." Michael was intrigued by this statement. While he was accustomed to being recognized by fans, there was something different about Albert's manner, less starstruck than purposeful, as if this meeting held particular significance for him. "You've been hoping to meet me?" Michael asked, settling onto the bench beside Albert. Albert continued breaking bread and distributing it to the pigeons, but Michael could sense that his attention was now focused on their conversation. "It's a long story," Albert said carefully. "Goes back to the war, World War II. You probably don't remember, and you would have been very young at the time." Michael felt a familiar stirring of interest and concern. Conversations about the war often led to revelations about his family's experiences during those difficult years, experiences that had shaped his childhood and his understanding of courage, sacrifice, and survival. "I was born in 1933, Michael said, "so I would have been between 6 and 12 during the war years. I remember quite a lot, actually. My family lived in Rotherhithe near the docks." Albert nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had long suspected. "Rotherhithe," he repeated. "Yes, that's right, near the Surrey commercial docks. Terrible bombing there during the Blitz. The Germans were trying to destroy the port facilities. We were bombed out twice," Michael said. "Had to find new places to live, lost everything we owned. It was a difficult time for my family." Albert's hand stilled on the bread he was breaking, and he turned to look directly at Michael. "September 15th, 1940, Albert said quietly. A Saturday night. Do you remember that night? Michael felt a chill of recognition. September 15th, 1940, was a date that had been seared into his family's memory, the night of one of the heaviest bombing raids of the Blitz, the night his family had nearly died. I remember, Michael said slowly. That was the night our house was hit. We barely got out alive. Albert nodded, his eyes bright with emotion. You barely got out alive because someone came and got you out, he said. Someone who happened to be walking through your neighborhood when the bombs started falling. Someone who heard voices coming from the rubble of your house and dug through the debris until he found your family. Michael stared at Albert, understanding beginning to dawn on him. That was you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That was me, Albert confirmed. I was 27 years old, working as an air raid warden for that district. When the bombing started that night, I was making my rounds, checking to make sure everyone had gotten to the shelters. But I was running late, and by the time I got to your street, the bombs were already falling. Albert's voice took on the distant quality of someone reliving events that had happened nearly 50 years earlier. Your house had taken a direct hit. The front wall had collapsed, and there was debris everywhere. I was about to mark the building as a total loss when I heard voices from inside. A woman's voice calling for help. Michael felt his heart racing as Albert described the night that had nearly ended his family's story before it had really begun. I started digging through the rubble with my bare hands. Albert continued. After about 20 minutes, I managed to clear enough debris to reach the family trapped inside. There was a woman, a man, and 2 small children. A little girl about 4 years old and a boy who looked to be about 7. That was us, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. My mother Ellen, my father Maurice, my younger brother Stanley, and me. Your mother kept thanking me over and over, Albert said, tears visible in his eyes. She said I had saved her babies, that she would never forget what I had done, but I told her that anyone would have done the same thing. It wasn't anything special. Michael was overwhelmed by the realization that he was sitting next to the man who had saved his entire family's lives, the man whose actions had made possible everything that followed: his career, his achievements, his children, grandchildren, everything. Albert, he said, struggling to find words adequate to the moment, you saved our lives. Without you, none of us would have survived that night. I did what needed to be done, Albert said simply. But I want you to know that I've followed your career over the years. I've seen all your films, read interviews with you, watched you become one of Britain's most successful actors, and I've always felt proud, knowing that I played a small part in making that possible. Michael felt tears beginning to stream down his face as he absorbed the magnitude of what Albert was telling him. Albert, it wasn't a small part, he said. It was everything. You gave us our lives. You gave me the chance to become who I am. They sat in silence for several minutes, both men processing the emotional weight of this unexpected reunion. Can I ask you something? Michael said finally. Of course. Why are you here feeding pigeons in Russell Square? I mean, do you live nearby? Albert's expression grew sadder, and Michael sensed that there was more to Albert's story than the heroic rescue from 1940. I come here every day, Albert said. Have been for the past 15 years, ever since my wife died. This is where Margaret and I used to come when we were courting back in 1939 before the war started. We'd sit on this very bench and talk about our plans for the future. Albert gestured toward the pigeons still pecking at the bread around their feet. Margaret loved feeding the birds. She said they reminded her that there was still beauty and innocence in the world, even when everything seemed dark and terrible. After she died, I started coming here to feel close to her, to remember the good times. Michael was moved by the loneliness and devotion in Albert's explanation. Did you and Margaret have children? He asked gently. Albert shook his head. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. We had each other, though, and that was enough. 52 years of marriage, and I never spent a single day regretting that I had chosen her. Albert's voice became even softer. After she died, I started thinking about all the people I had helped during the war, families I had pulled from bombed buildings, people I had guided to safety during air raids. I wondered what had happened to them, whether they had lived good lives, whether the time I had given them had been used well. He looked directly at Michael. That's why meeting you means so much to me, Seeing what you've accomplished, how you've used your life to bring joy and entertainment to millions of people, it makes me feel like those nights during the Blitz weren't just about survival. They were about preserving possibilities, protecting futures that were worth saving. Michael was profoundly moved by Albert's reflection on the meaning of his wartime service. "Albert," he said, "what you did during the war wasn't just about saving individual lives. You were preserving hope, protecting families, ensuring that love and dreams and possibilities could continue. That's heroism on the most fundamental level." Albert waved away Michael's praise with characteristic modesty. "No," Michael said firmly. "Not anyone would have done what you did. Many people would have been too afraid, too concerned with their own safety. You risked your life for strangers, night after night throughout the entire Blitz." Michael paused, struck by a sudden thought. "Albert, I want to ask you something important. Do you have family? Children, grandchildren, people who are taking care of you?" Albert shook his head. "No family left. A few distant relatives, but we're not close. I live in a small flat in Bloomsbury. Not far from here. It's enough for an old man." Michael felt a surge of purpose and determination. "Albert, I won't accept that. You saved my family's life. You made everything I've achieved possible. That makes you family." Albert looked surprised by the intensity of Michael's response. "You don't owe me anything," Albert said. "I'm glad to know that you survived and thrived, but you don't owe me anything." "With respect, Albert, I disagree completely. I owe you everything, and more importantly, I want you in my life. I want to know you, to learn from you, to make sure that your final years are filled with the same kind of joy and comfort that you made possible for my family." Michael's voice grew stronger with conviction. "I want you to come to dinner with my family. I want you to meet my children, my wife. I want them to know the man who saved their father's life." Albert was clearly overwhelmed by Michael's proposal. "You wouldn't be imposing," Michael said. "You'd be coming home." Over the following weeks, Michael gradually introduced Albert into his family's life. The process began with quiet dinners at Michael's home, where Albert met Michael's wife Shakira and his children Dominique and Natasha. "This is Albert Whitman," Michael told his family during that first dinner. "He saved Daddy's life during the war, and that means he saved all of our lives too." The children, then teenagers, were initially somewhat reserved around Albert, not quite sure how to relate to this quiet, elderly man who had suddenly become part of their family's story. But Albert's gentle humor and obvious affection for Michael gradually won them over. "Albert," Natasha asked during one dinner conversation, "what was Daddy like when he was little?" Albert smiled at the memory. "He was very small, very thin, but very brave. When I pulled him out of that bombed house, he wasn't crying even though he must have been terrified. He was trying to comfort his little brother and help his parents. Even at 7 years old, he was taking care of other people." Shakira was moved by Albert's stories about the war and his descriptions of Michael's family during those difficult years. "Albert," she said, "Michael has told us some things about his childhood, but hearing about it from someone who was there, who knew his parents during the war, it helps us understand where his strength and values come from." Albert became a regular presence at family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and quiet Sunday dinners. His presence provided a connection to Michael's past that had been missing for decades, and his gentle wisdom and perspective enriched conversations about everything from career decisions to family relationships. "Having Albert as part of our family changed how we understood our own story," Dominique said years later. "We realized that we existed because of this man's courage, and that gave us a sense of responsibility to live up to the sacrifice he had made." Albert's influence on Michael's career was equally profound. Their regular conversations about courage, duty, and the importance of helping others influenced Michael's choice of roles and his approach to using his fame and influence. "Albert taught me that heroism isn't about grand gestures or recognition," Michael reflected. "It's about doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost or whether anyone will ever know about it." This philosophy influenced Michael's charitable work and his approach to supporting causes that aligned with Albert's values of service and sacrifice. Michael established the Albert Whitman Memorial Fund for Emergency Service Workers, which provides financial assistance and support to firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and other first responders who are injured or killed in the line of duty. Albert represented the very best of what it means to serve others, Michael explained when announcing the fund. He risked his life every night during the Blitz to save people he had never met. That kind of selfless service deserves recognition and support. Albert lived with the knowledge that he had been recognized and honored for his wartime service for 8 more years after his reunion with Michael. During those years he became not just part of Michael's family but a beloved grandfather figure to Michael's children and a wise counselor to Michael himself. Albert taught us that every act of kindness and courage creates ripple effects that extend far beyond what we can see or imagine, Michael said at Albert's funeral in 1996. When he pulled my family from that bombed building in 1940, he wasn't just saving 4 lives. He was preserving all the lives that would come from those lives, my children, their children, all the people we would help and influence throughout our lifetimes. Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion. Albert never sought recognition for what he did. He was content to know that the people he had saved were living good lives. But I want everyone here to understand that Albert Whitman was a hero in the truest sense of the word. He embodied the values of courage, selflessness, and service that make civilization possible. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Albert during his 8 years as part of Michael's extended family. Former air raid wardens who had served with Albert during the war, families he had helped during and after the Blitz, and people who had come to know him through his association with Michael, all gathered to honor a man who had spent his life helping others without expectation of recognition or reward. At the graveside, Michael placed a simple wreath with a card that read, "To Albert, you saved my life, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to your example of courage and kindness." In the years following Albert's death, Michael continued to honor his memory through the charitable foundation and through his personal commitment to helping others whenever possible. "Albert taught me that we're all connected in ways we don't understand," Michael said in a 2005 interview. "The stranger you help today might be the person whose children grow up to cure cancer or write beautiful music or simply raise kind, compassionate children of their own. Every act of courage and kindness creates possibilities that extend far into the future." The story of Michael's reunion with Albert became one of his most frequently told anecdotes, shared in interviews, speeches, and conversations with young people who were struggling to understand how individual actions could make a difference in the world. "Meeting Albert again after all those years taught me that heroism isn't about fame or recognition," Michael would explain. "It's about seeing what needs to be done and having the courage to do it, regardless of whether anyone will ever thank you or even know what you did." Today, a bench in Russell Square bears a small plaque that reads, "In memory of Albert Whitman, 1913 to 1996. Air raid warden, hero, friend. He fed the pigeons here every day and saved lives every night." Michael visits the bench several times each year, usually carrying bread to continue Albert's tradition of feeding the pigeons. On these visits, he often reflects on the extraordinary series of events that led to their reunion and the profound impact that Albert's friendship had on his understanding of family, duty, and the connections that bind human lives together across decades. When Michael Caine found the old man feeding pigeons in Russell Square that September morning in 1988, he thought he was simply observing a lonely pensioner performing a daily ritual. He discovered that the man sitting on that bench had saved his entire family's lives nearly 50 years earlier, and that their chance meeting would create a relationship that enriched both of their remaining years while demonstrating the profound truth that acts of courage and kindness can echo across generations in ways that the people who perform them never imagine. Albert Whitman spent his life serving others without expectation of recognition or reward, but in his final years he experienced the deep satisfaction of knowing that the lives he had saved had been lived with purpose, meaning, and gratitude for the gift of time that his courage had made possible. But the story of Albert and Michael's relationship revealed layers of connection and meaning that went far beyond their initial wartime encounter. As their friendship deepened over the months following their reunion, Michael learned more about Albert's life, his service during the war, and the quiet heroism that had defined his approach to every challenge he faced. Albert had served as an air raid warden throughout the entire London Blitz from September 1940 through May 1941. During those 8 months of nightly bombing raids, he had saved dozens of lives, pulling people from collapsed buildings, guiding families to safety through streets filled with debris and unexploded ordnance, and providing comfort and assistance to those who had lost everything. Every night was like walking into hell, Albert told Michael during one of their regular conversations. The noise was indescribable. Mimers overhead, anti-aircraft guns firing, buildings collapsing, people screaming. But you just did what needed to be done. There wasn't time to think about being afraid. Albert's wartime service had taken a profound physical and emotional toll. He had been buried alive twice when buildings collapsed around him, suffered permanent hearing damage from explosive blasts, and witnessed scenes of destruction and human suffering that haunted him for decades. "I never talked about the war with Margaret," Albert confided to Michael. "She knew I had nightmares sometimes, but I didn't want to burden her with the details of what I had seen. She had her own memories of those years, losing friends in the bombing, rationing, the constant fear that I might not come home one night." Michael was struck by Albert's modesty about his wartime service and his reluctance to describe himself as heroic, despite the obvious courage he had displayed night after night for months. "Albert," Michael said during one conversation, "you saved my family and dozens of other families. You risked your life every night to help strangers. How can you not see that as heroic?" Albert was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "I suppose I never thought about it that way because everyone was doing their part. The firefighters, the rescue workers, the medical personnel, the ordinary citizens who opened their homes to people who had been bombed out. We were all just doing what the situation required." Albert's perspective on heroism reflected a generation's understanding of duty and service that Michael found both humbling and inspiring. "Albert taught me that real heroism isn't about individual glory," Michael reflected years later. "It's about being part of something larger than yourself, contributing to a collective effort to preserve what's good and decent in the world." This understanding influenced Michael's approach to his own philanthropic work and public service. He began gravitating toward causes that supported collective efforts rather than projects that would bring him individual recognition. The friendship between Albert and Michael also revealed the loneliness and isolation that many elderly people experience, particularly those who have outlived their contemporaries and lost their immediate family members. "Meeting you has given me a purpose I thought I'd lost when Margaret died," Albert told Michael one afternoon as they sat together in Russell Square. "For 15 years I've been coming to this park every day, feeding these birds, remembering the past. But having you and your family in my life has given me a reason to think about the future again." Michael was moved by Albert's honesty about his loneliness and determined to ensure that Albert's remaining years would be filled with companionship and meaning. This commitment led to Michael including Albert in virtually every aspect of his family life. Albert attended birthday parties, holiday celebrations, film premieres, and family vacations. He became a confidant to Michael's children, offering advice and perspective from his 8 decades of life experience. "Albert became the grandfather we had never really had," Natasha said years later. "He taught us about resilience, about finding meaning and service to others, about the importance of remembering and honoring the sacrifices that previous generations had made for our freedom." Albert's influence on Michael's children was particularly significant because he provided them with a direct connection to the war generation and its values of duty, sacrifice, and perseverance. Albert would tell us stories about the war, but not in a way that glorified violence or made it seem romantic, Dominique recalled. "He helped us understand that war was terrible, but that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they were called upon to defend what they believed in." Albert's presence in the family also influenced Michael's approach to aging and mortality. Watching Albert navigate the challenges of advanced age with dignity and grace provided Michael with a model for how to face his own future with courage and acceptance. Albert never complained about his physical limitations or the losses he had experienced, Michael observed. He focused on what he could still do, what he could still contribute, what he could still enjoy. "That taught me not to fear getting older, but to see it as another stage of life that could be lived with purpose and meaning." The relationship between Albert and Michael also demonstrated the power of intergenerational friendship to enrich both participants' lives. Albert provided Michael with wisdom, perspective, and connection to history, while Michael provided Albert with energy, purpose, and connection to the present. "Their friendship was remarkable to witness," observed Michael Caine. "Michael learned from Albert's experience and wisdom, but Albert also learned from Michael's enthusiasm and engagement with contemporary life. They both became better people through their relationship." Albert's death in 1996 at age 83 marked the end of a friendship that had profoundly influenced both men's understanding of courage, service, and the connections that bind human lives together across time and circumstance. In his final weeks, Albert was cared for in Michael's home, surrounded by the family that had adopted him and honored him as the hero he had always been, but had never acknowledged himself to be. At the end, Albert was at peace. Michael said at the funeral, he had lived to see that the lives he had saved during the war had been used well, that the courage he had shown had made possible generations of love, achievement, and service to others. The memorial service for Albert was attended by representatives from the Imperial War Museum, the London Fire Brigade, and veterans organizations who wanted to honor his service and sacrifice. But the most moving tributes came from Michael's children and grandchildren, who spoke about the lessons Albert had taught them about courage, humility, and the importance of helping others. "Albert showed us that heroes don't wear capes or seek recognition," said Dominique in her eulogy. "They quietly do what needs to be done night after night, year after year, because they understand that we're all connected and that we all have a responsibility to take care of each other." In the years following Albert's death, Michael established several memorial programs designed to honor Albert's legacy and support the values he had embodied throughout his life. The Albert Whitman Emergency Services Scholarship provides financial assistance to young people pursuing careers as first responders. The scholarship program emphasizes character development and commitment to service. Albert understood that emergency service work requires people who are willing to risk their own safety to help others, Michael explained. That's the kind of person this scholarship aims to support. Michael also worked with the Russell Square Garden Committee to create a memorial garden near the bench where he and Albert were reunited, ensuring that Albert's tradition of feeding birds continues. The story of Michael and Albert's reunion also became the subject of a documentary film that Michael produced in 2005. The film explores themes of wartime service, intergenerational relationships, and the importance of remembering previous generations' sacrifices. "Making that documentary taught me even more about Albert's generation and what they had endured during the war," Michael reflected. "Their courage made possible everything that followed, the peace and freedom that my generation has been able to take for granted." Today, nearly 3 decades after their reunion in Russell Square, Michael continues to visit Albert's memorial bench several times each year, often carrying bread to feed the pigeons and honoring the memory of a man whose quiet heroism had saved his family. The chance encounter between a famous actor and an elderly man feeding pigeons became a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized, and that the connections between human lives can span decades and transform understanding in ways that seem miraculous, but are actually the natural result of courage, kindness, and love extending their influence across time.